Alrighty, guys, we have made it to our very last lesson, lesson 19. This is the 20th century present day. This is definitely my favorite part of art history to talk about. It kind of leads more into like the more modern movements and just kind of tells you where we are 100 years or so, really, where a lot of this. I will say there are a lot more videos that are in this from this era, so I like to put a video. Just a reminder to watch all those as well as the lesson 19 video. This will probably be two parts because this is a little bit of a lengthy lesson. I just kind of like to hit this the hardest as far as art history goes, just so you guys can know sort of where we're at today and just get a sense of how the art world has changed and where we've came from and where we are in the present day. So um, although I'm kind of like emphasizing the newness of this era, we do have to kind of start early on in the early 20th century, so like early 1900s, and some features and like just some characteristics of that time period that really sort of pushed us into this new era of art. So lots of changing views are going on. We have philosophers and just inventors, different big names like Sigmund Freud, the Wright brothers, Marie and Pierre Curie, and Einstein as well. So a lot of just big changes are happening as far as like the way that we're thinking about things, as well as the impact of the Industrial Revolution, which obviously sparked a lot of bigger things, but also some controversy as well. We see things like the middle class having a longer life expectancy. There are lots of revolutions going on, lots of sort of like very tense wars going on as well. And artists are inspired by these new scientific discoveries that we sort of are beginning to lean on more than like our reliance on religion and spirituality. We sort of see this outweigh of like new science discoveries and things like that, that things start to be influenced by even heavier. Some characteristics of the 20th century art world: lots of change, lots of diversity, lots of focus on individualism, and just a lot of exploring and sort of like creativity. You'll notice early on that there are lots of movements that sort of are happening simultaneously, unlike our other art history where we have more like big chunks of time that are sort of dominated by one movement. There are hundreds of art, like sub art movements going on in the 20th century, and they're all sort of happening simultaneously and sort of embody different ideas. So just kind of buckle in and just take this as just sort of little ride, I guess, like amusement park ride of just sort of looking at different parts of art culture. But we might speed by them kind of quickly, and others we might talk about a little bit more. But there is a lot that happens during this time period. So let's start out with where that sort of all begins. It starts with the two movements really, and we talked about expressionism a bit in the last lesson in lesson 18, but also Fauvism as well. Fauve artists use pure, brilliant color very aggressively and applied straight from the paint tubes to create a sense of explosion on the canvas. So instead of like mixing and really thinking like intensely on color theory and that sort of things. This was more sort of playful and impulsive. Definitely more in the abstract realm. We're not trying to like match realism. And I will say that Fauvism and Expressionism, the timing for them really depended a lot on the technology that was evolving during this time as well. So we start to see like more sturdy, stable uses of photography happening alongside this as well. And so we talked early on about how that like painting has had a lot of near death experiences, and this was definitely one of them. So when photography starts to sort of like take fruition, people question, what makes painting special if this all this time we've just been trying to, at least in a Eurocentric like sort of canon, we have been trying to achieve perfection and perfect realism and all of this. So we can just use a camera for those things now. So where does that leave painting at? And so a lot of artists start taking inspiration from more abstract art cultures. So Matisse, for example, we see a lot of color and a lot of like subject matter and just application of the medium from different African cultures, some Asian cultures as well, sort of take fruition here. But we start to kind of like look outside of ourselves as far as this Eurocentric canon that we have sort of followed throughout all history, and we start looking at how other cultures use art as a means of creating something. So let's jump back into Fauvism and what that means specifically. So les Fauves is sort of like the French word for this movement. It means wild beast, and it sort of embodied what their ideas were about, and sort of like their energy. Matisse, he fell into this movement very in the middle there, and uses expressive, thoughtful paintings. He reduced his subjects to just a few outlines to preserve the original impulse of the feeling. And this is called the joy of life. It's intentionally direct, very childlike quality of form, and seemingly careless depiction of the figure. So we're more so trying to capture like a mood or a feeling, or not so much like we're trying to accurately represent like what something physically looks like, but more so get the feeling or the mood, or of this type of thing. Think back to like our romantic painters sort of use some qualities in this, like more abstraction, more sort of like exaggerations, simplifications, that sort of thing. Fauvism, though, although it had a really big impact, it only lasted for 2 years between 1905 and 1907. Very influential, especially in the early 20th century. It sort of kickstarted a lot of other movements that came after it. And the work led to increasing use of color as an independent expressive element rather than just trying to like I guess use color and use paint to like mask the illusion of something. Some expressionist painters, which again, we talked about expressionism a bit in the last chapter, but I'll kind of touch on it again briefly. It's the general term for art that emphasizes inner feelings over the objective depictions. So, sort of, the mentality of what abstract art is. German expressionism was very popular. There were themes of natural life, sorrow, spirituality, mythos, the human condition portrayed. We oftentimes see very vivid, often angular simplifications of subjects, a lot of dramatic color contrast, and it's built on Gauguin and Van Gogh and Munch, some very famous painters, as we know, who've sort of worked in this style earlier in like the 1800s. This compelled to address the human condition. We see natural life, sorrow, passion, spirituality, mythism, and is influenced by medieval German art and art from Africa and Oceania. So this is Franz Klein, who is a German expressionist painter, very well known name. And you can see that he's more so just he's using very raw elements, like line and color and shape, to convey a feeling or a mood rather than trying to get like representing like actuality, which I think the reason for this, and I think others would argue this as well, is that really art depicting realism and not really going much further than that is just sort of like a redundant task, especially after the invention of photography. Why are we trying to reach this level of accuracy where we could just take a picture of it? I mean, like, what are you trying to add to the conversation? And this is a lot of artists are sort of going through that process of understanding, what is it that we want to bring new to the art world, and what do we really want to say with this work, and how can we do it and approach it differently than we have in the past. This is another expressionist piece. It is the Bridge. It's by the Bridge Group. This is specifically Paula Becker, is how I always have said her name, but Paula Becker does a very reduction of curves, a reduced curves of head and flat regions, uses oversized eyes in her piece as well. I just always have found this piece really beautiful. I think that it just sort of captures a feeling and a mood and an energy rather than it trying to create an accurate portrayal of this person. I love the softness of color, the softness of lines, the sort of simplification of the shapes here, and also just the sort of like fun, playful background that she has going. But She's still using a lot of observed color, observed lighting. Um, but yeah, there's just something about the expression on the face. Just it feels very deep and longing, and I don't know that we would be able to achieve this type of feeling with creating this just as representational as we possibly can. Some more expressionist paintings. This is the Blue Rider Group. It's led by Kandinsky. It is art to turn people away from false values. So yeah, again, still just sort of playing into this idea of simplification of shapes, and and also just again exploring what art can be and what it will be. This is again the Blue Rider Group, led by Kandinsky. There is a shift to non-representational imagery that happens in 1910. So really, Kandinsky was a big proponent of that movement of when we go into more non-objective and non-representational imagery, which is one of our big categories when we talk about types of different art. However, it doesn't really come into fruition until around this time, like early-ish 1900s. This broke the rule that art should be a picture of some subject. It doesn't necessarily have to be that we are making artwork that is representational or even abstract of something else. So Kandinsky, the way he sort of jump started this, and I feel like I maybe have talked about one of his pieces like this before, but we'll kind of in this context talk about it again. So this is non-representational art for Kandinsky was art in response to inner necessity and spirituality. So the way that he began doing that, there was a movement at Black Mountain College, and just the group of Black Mountain College, which is around like the Asheville area. It's no longer in the work or like in production, I guess, in use as a college. But Black Mountain College was a place where different artists could come together, whether they be poets or writers or visual artists like we are talking about in our class, or musicians, and they could collaborate and kind of like have this space of just like collaboration, just kind of play and feed off of one another. So this is called Composition 5. I'm really bad with Roman numerals, but I believe it's 5. And this was Kandinsky reacting from a composition piece done by a pianist, I believe. And so there's no words, there's nothing that's like, telling you to feel a sort of way. It all is just impulsive. It's all just a feeling, a mood. And so Kandinsky would listen to the compositions and then paint how they made him feel, whether there were different highs and lows and colors that sort of stood out in the song, or things like that. And so this was one of his many composition pieces that reacted to a actual compositional piece. Another movement we see is Cubism that happens sort of around early 1900s. The Spanish artist Picasso and the French artist Jorge Barak pursued this investigations that led to Cubism. Um, Essentially, Cubism is when there is pictorial compositions over personal expressions. So the composition of the artwork here is really, really important in how you're setting up your piece. It's heavily influenced basic visual structure of many notable paintings and sculptures, even if they weren't in the Cubist movement. This sort of technique that accompanied Cubism became really popular with other movements as well. Has become a big part of our daily lives as well. There is direct influence on the architecture and the arts that we see everywhere, whether it be different architectural styles that have developed since then, or art styles, and so on and so forth. Um, I would say though, or I do want to kind of point out though that Cubism is definitely very, very heavily derived from traditional African artworks and sculptures and paintings that we see in just, I mean, classic African art. It's not a new thing. It's was sort of like rediscovered, I guess, by like Picasso and other artists, but it's not something they came up with on their own. They maybe coined the term Cubism, but as far as what was happening and taking place in Cubism, I think it's definitely a sort of misconstruction that is by Picasso. It's definitely he is just being influenced by other styles and different cultures to create his own type of movement, which is Cubism. Um, So the breakthrough painting by Picasso for Cubism was Les Désormais d'Armagnan, and we'll look at that in just a second. But it's a radical departure from traditional composition. It's influenced highly by African sculptures such as the Coda figure that we see up here, and then the African or the Ivory Coast mask that we see down here. So just kind of like look at some of the elements that are taking place in both of these: simplification of form, exaggerated and distorted proportions, and yeah, it's definitely not in our European style that we have seen before this. This is the piece that we're referencing here. You've probably seen this piece if you've seen a Picasso piece before. It's probably been this one. It's definitely the most notable, I would say, throughout history. And this is just really all about the composition. I wouldn't really go too far into like the content of this piece. It's really just the subject matter and how he is arranging it in his composition and how he is choosing to simplify and distort and exaggerate different figure or features on these bodies. So again, radical departure from traditional composition, reconstruction of image and ground, fractured triangulation of forms. So we see the shape of the triangle take place a lot in the different figures, and also overturned traditions of Western art that we have known pretty much up until now. And again, influenced by those two pieces that I showed you before. Now, analytical cubism, it's a little bit different than our just, overhead term of cubism. It's when we analyze subjects from various angles and then kind of just like overlap them on top of one another and then paint the abstract geometric references. So this is called the Portuguese. It's a portrait of a man at a cafe table strumming a guitar. Probably wouldn't get that initially, but just imagine that you were, doing this from real life and you were taking a portrait or taking a picture of this person playing their guitar at the cafe table from the left side, the right side, the front, the back, overhead, like bird's eye view, underneath them, and then you just overlap those all together to kind of give the illusion of like you're really immersed in the space and you feel like you're inside of it, but it's kind of happening all at once. It's not happening in the order that is natural. It's not like a video where you can kind of pan around. It's just overlapping and all sort of stacking on top of one another at once. um, Synthetic cubism is a modified analytical cubism using color, texture, and pattern surfaces. So, really, I would just say this is a fancy word for like what collage is today. It's when shapes are taken from cutout shapes and then they're collaged and printed images onto paper. This is violin, fruit, and wine glass. And we're sort of setting up this composition to, although we kind of are seeing these different things singularly or individually from different angles, they're sort of arranged into this space, I guess. So we have like the violin down here. We've got this like little kind of makeshift table where these pairs are sitting on. And just lots of kind of things are happening and collaged together from various places to create a new scene or a new space. Synthetic cubism, we don't see it a whole lot happening in sculpture, but we do see it in this piece here where this is sort of like an assembled sculpture. If we think back on our sculpture chapter, this is assembled sheet metal pieces all sort of like stacked together. And the work began to dominate the trend towards sculptural construction. And this is also where we see sort of the first signs of assembled sculpture. Like I said, this is assembled sculpture is not an old thing. It's definitely something that's sort of occurred in the last 120 years or so. And this is kind of our first taste of that. The guitar has since had a great deal has been constructed of the piece, but we brought it together and brought these different pieces and sort of collaged them into something new. I don't know why it's so tiny, but let's look a little bit toward abstract sculpture and sort of what we've talked a lot about painting and sort of like the composing of a painting, but sculpture sort of starts to see this trend as well of like simplification. Konstantin Brnkowski is one of the biggest names in this sort of simplification process. He is a Romanian who studied under Rodin, very radical yet gradual break from the past. So we see this piece here that's more traditional, obviously, and there's like a simplification of it. It almost is like, and I feel like I've brought this movie up like more than once in this class, which is just weird. But the Disney movie, Pixar movie, Inside Out, where the characters like go through that simplification cell thing to get to the train on the other side, and they start to like deconstruct as they're in there and sort of simplify into really just like some basic like circles and uh, triangles and squares and colors. This is kind of how I see sculpture happening here. It's like, we have this more kind of solid, realistic version of what it is that the subject is, and then we reduce it so much that it almost becomes unrecognizable unless you have that reference from the beginning. But just really interesting, I think, progression of sculpture and just sort of, shift into where it was and how we sort of ended up with it. Um, just some more abstraction and sculpture. This is another piece by Bunkowski, and it is the journey back to pre-classical styles from the Cyclades. This is one of the heads that we see here. Or sorry, this is one of the heads that we see here. Very intense simplification. Obviously, really the only prominent feature is the nose, but we can assume where the eyes and the mouth might be, and the ears and all that. This is Bird in Space. It is cast bronze, and it's also done by the same artist. It's implying a soaring motion, and it's highly reflective of its bronze surface. It has a very weightless quality to about it. So, although it is not a bird, obviously, I think it's supposed to sort of like encapsulate the feeling of a bird and just sort of like their characteristics that they have, and sort of give you this connection to it. Alrighty. Let's get through a couple more slides here. Sorry, I don't mean to go away from it. Yeah, we'll get through 10 or so more slides, and then we'll call it quits on the first part. Let me get back to the so early modern art in the U.S., the Armory Show is something that's a really really big deal around like the early 1900s. We have like the French Salon that we talked about in our last chapter, but the Armory Show is something new, and it's still ongoing today. They still hold it annually, but it gave the American public the first look at developments in European art. So it was sort of like a convention of art from from different parts of like the Western world. Um, it opened in New York in 1913, and organizers tried to demonstrate that modern art was not revolutionary. Um, the American public is shocked at seeing the first signs of Cubism and Expressionism, which have been reserved to the European countries. And Cubism and other abstract forms began spreading really rapidly now across the United States. Um, some photography and painting from early modern art and just sort of its influences as well. Alfred Stieglitz is a really really like big name in our early photography. This is he starts to kind of play with photography not only being like a new development in technology but also a new development in art as well, which was kind of there was some tension I think amongst people about if photography could be used as an art form and technical development, because it wasn't something that you naturally were doing with your hands, I guess, in the same way that we have thought about art thus far. It's more of like a technical thing, but we start applying different elements and principles of art to photographies and photographs, and this overlap just starts to sort of happen. um, the abstract composition that we see here, it's looked to some like two photographs that have been overlapped with one another, or kind of collaged together. The shapes and underlying feeling of stress is very intentional in the composition. Stieglitz opens an influential gallery that includes photography in New York, which becomes really profound because we aren't really seeing photography in our art galleries up until then. And he began to show work by the American modernist as well. Some more photography and painting and early art or early modern art. Georgia O'Keeffe, who we probably all know the name, but maybe don't know a lot of her work. Her work consists of abstractions based on nature, and she has a pretty intense simplification of her art as well, like we see here. This is Evening Star. It's based on the sightings of the planet Venus in a darkening sky in the Texas Panhandle. Venus is left unpainted, so we see Venus as being this sort of overlapped little spot right there. And the wide radiating sweeps of saturated color just really emphasize that, expressionistic quality that we're seeing a lot more. And the architecture, where does that kind of fall in this? Frank Lloyd Wright, who we've already kind of talked about pretty extensively, is an architect that is known for his modern architecture. I feel like if you know one name in modern architecture, it's probably Frank Lloyd Wright. His architecture reflects the challenge in traditional concepts of form. He had these series of prairie houses with very open floor plans. But if we can remember, some things that Frank Lloyd Wright really focused on in his modern architecture was very open floor plans, lots of glass walls and ceilings, trying to exist within harmony in nature or wherever the house is present at, and kind of, take elements from nature and put them into the design. And also have a really good open flow within things. So, yeah, we've already talked about him a lot, so I won't go much more into it. Okay, Futurism, another movement that's sort of kind of coming around this time, around, early 1900s, 1910s, 20s, that sort of thing. Italian Futurism, which is kind of where this starts at, the big focus on it is motion and speed. And so trying to capture sort of, a moment in time, or like a shifting or transitional moment. It has lots of elements of cubism to it. It celebrated machines and sort of like technology in that way, transportation. This is called abstract speed. The car has passed. So the feeling, or like kind of energy that this wants you to feel, is that kind of like swoosh that happens after like a car would speed by you really quickly. It's sort of, the air is very sort of tumbling, and it's not something that you can really see, but you can definitely feel it. And so I think this does a really great job of sort of capturing and encapsulating that feeling of that. Yeah. We start to see futurism as well in sculpture, and sort of implying there's some motion happening without it actually having to be in motion. Um, this is one of those pieces. It is a sculpture fused with surrounding space, and sort of trying to capture that like motion, or that like airflow current thing when you're walking, or going really really fast from place to place. Marcel Duchamp is another really big name in Futurism. This is Nude Descending a Staircase #2, which we have, I believe, again talked about before. This is definitely a slide identification on our exam, though. So remember this piece if you're going to remember one of the slides we've looked at recently. Um, this is influenced by stroboscopic photography. It's where the movement of the body is seen all at once. So kind of back to that like analytical cubism that we were looking at a little earlier. It's initially described as an explosion in a shingle factory, but you can see here this is like a figure sort of descending the stairs and trying to capture that motion all at once. Um, I really like this piece as well. This is Sonia Delaney Turk, Les Ball Billiere. It's interpretation of couples moving on the floor of a nightclub, which you might not get that at first, but just like with that hint of the title, you can start to see little figures sort of embracing and sort of moving and twirling around this very like panoramic view. There's a good push and pull of colors that bring depth to the space. So, really, really knowledgeable about color theory. And honestly, I think that kind of moving into abstract artwork like this, to do it successfully and to use the elements and principles of design in an organized way is almost harder than doing it representationally, because with the representational piece, you know what it is you're looking at, and it's just right there in front of you. But you really have to like project and like see what's coming to fully understand abstract artwork, and how to execute it in a way that is successful. So, knowing when to push and pull these colors, and brighten areas, and, mute areas more, and bring, figures forward and push them back, and use vertical alignment and all of that. Um, it takes a lot of like good skill, like a very, very good knowledge of your subject. So yeah, that's just kind of like a take on all of these movements together. So, and where am I? Let me see here. Sorry, let me skip ahead. I just want to see how much more we've got. I'll talk about a couple more. Um, we'll do 2 or 3 more slides. Post World War II, we start to see there's a lot of sort of deviation, lots of restless and very like wildly creative time. And really, whatever an artist did became artwork. If you're bringing something into the gallery space, it's art. And it sort of like is this culmination of like individualism, learning the artist's names, rather than like the artwork itself. But knowing an artist's name sort of makes anything they do valuable or successful or valid to make its way into the art world. And so that really changes a lot of things, that focus on individualism. um so just to kind of like talk about what's going on in the world during this time. Europe is in just ruins. There are millions of deaths. Prominent artists that are in Europe fled to the US for, just a safe haven. And modernism found its new home away from Europe and in New York, and where it's still, I mean, postmodernism and just art in general sort of lands in New York, and that's still the epicenter, really. It's living in a world that has the power to destroy in minutes. So we're really nothing's off limits. Nothing's off the table. We've nearly experienced, we haven't nearly. We've experienced a really the biggest tragedy and the biggest loss the world has seen in years and years and years. And so we're just like, screw it. Let's just do whatever we want to do. And if you like it, good. If not, fine. Doesn't matter. So very rebellious time, I would say. As far as like art goes, this is definitely the most rebellious time. And a lot happens post World War II. A lot of movements start to speed up really quickly if you don't think they already have from our, previous part of this chapter. So the New York School, this is where a lot of our ideas sort of take off. We have not only expressionism but abstract expressionism, where that idea that like Kandinsky brings on early on about sort of non-representational, not having more so leaning into like the spirituality and the feeling of something rather than its like realism or its attachment to something physical. Happens in the New York School. The biggest name that I have for this is Jackson Pollock, and we've already talked about him one other time about his action painting style, but he is an abstract expressionist and probably the like closest. When you hear abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock is who you think of, or who most people would think of, I would think. Um, and abstract expressionism, it's a culmination of Fauves, German expressionist, and surrealism. It is realms other than representational and narrative. Jackson Pollock painted for the age of the atom bomb and the radio, and leading to his innovative techniques, such as dripping thin paint onto the canvas. So this was his sort of style. It was very process oriented. Sometimes watching the videos of him like create one of his paintings, for me anyway, is more profound than seeing them in person, like the actual finished product. It's definitely more about the process and sort of capturing this moment in time, actually like the process of doing it rather than the end like product that is made. This is one of his pieces here. I believe this is also a slide ID, so try to remember this one. It's Autumn Rhythm number 30. It's an action painting, and it is controlled dancing movements to place paint using his action painting style. Let me see. We're going to stop right here because I'm a little bit worried that my upload's going to take a really long time to do. So jump back in for part 2 and we'll finish up on abstract expressionism and sort of move more into the present day. But yeah, just jump into part 2 right after this one.